Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On April 19th, 1882, in a country house in the village of Down, Kent, an old man lay dying. He was 73 years old, and his body had finally surrendered to the heart disease that had plagued him for years. The room was quiet except for his laboured breathing. His wife Emma sat nearby, exhausted from days of vigil. His children moved softly around him, knowing the end was near. Throughout his life, this man had been terrified of public speaking. He had avoided confrontation whenever possible. He had turned down honours and invitations, preferring the solitude of his study and the company of his plants and earthworms. Yet, in death, he would receive one of the greatest honours Britain could bestow. His body would lie not in the small churchyard of his village, as he had wished, but in Westminster Abbey, beside Isaac Newton and the kings of England. The physicians diagnosed anginal attacks and heart failure. As his breathing grew shallower, he called his family close. To Emma, his wife of 43 years, his first cousin whom he had married despite her deep religious faith and his growing doubts, he said, "I am not the least afraid of death. Remember what a good wife you've been to me. Tell all my children to remember how good they have been to me." While Emma rested briefly, he repeated to his daughter, Henrietta, and his son Francis, "It's almost worthwhile to be sick to be nursed by you." Then, as quietly as he'd lived, Charles Darwin was gone. Consider the strangeness of what had just happened. Here was a man who had spent the last decades of his life studying barnacles and earthworms, who had grown orchids in his greenhouse and counted the stamens of flowers, who had walked the same path around his garden thousands of times, a man who had been so seasick on the voyage that made him famous that he could barely function aboard ship, a man who suffered from mysterious illnesses for 40 years, who vomited after excitement, who could work only a few hours each day. And yet this invalid naturalist had changed everything. He had looked at finches on remote islands and seen the fingerprints of time itself. He had examined fossils in South American cliffs and understood that the earth had a history written in stone. He had watched pigeon breeders at work and grasped the fundamental mechanism by which all life transforms itself across the generations. He had taken an idea so dangerous that he hid it in his notebooks for 20 years, and when he finally published it, he split the Victorian world in two. The theory of evolution by natural selection would become the organising principle of all biology. It would explain the diversity of life on Earth, from bacteria to blue whales. It would unite paleontology and genetics, ecology and molecular biology. It would force humanity to see itself not as the pinnacle of creation, but as one branch among millions on the tree of life. 2. Centuries later, every discovery in biology would either confirm Darwin's insights or deepen them. No finding would overturn them. But to understand how the shy son of a wealthy country doctor became the most controversial scientist in history, we must go back to the beginning, to a comfortable house in an English market town, to a childhood shadowed by loss and shaped by the green fields and river valleys of Shropshire. Before we begin this journey through one of the most consequential lives in scientific history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm curious where in the world you're watching from tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now, settle in. The town of Shrewsbury sits at a loop in the River Severn in the English county of Shropshire, not far from the Welsh border. In the early 19th century, it was a prosperous market town of about 15,000 souls, built on the wool trade and the commerce that flowed along the river. Medieval streets climbed the hills. The ruins of an old abbey stood at the edge of town. The fields beyond rolled green and gentle toward distant Welsh mountains. On one of these hills stood a house called the Mount, built by Robert Darwin, the town's most prominent physician. It was a substantial brick mansion set in gardens that sloped down toward the river, surrounded by the countryside that wealthy Englishmen of that era cultivated as carefully as they cultivated their social standing. Here, in a second-floor room on February 12, 1809, Susanna Darwin gave birth to her fifth child. They named him Charles Robert Darwin. The same day, thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean, in a log cabin in Kentucky, another child was born who would also change the world. Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin entered life on the same winter day, though their paths would never cross. Charles was born into wealth and privilege of a particular English kind, not aristocratic grandeur, but comfortable professional prosperity. The Darwin family occupied that uniquely British position of educated gentlemen who worked for their living but lived like those who did not need to. His father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a physician with the shrewdness to invest his medical fees wisely. By the time Charles was born, Robert's investments had grown so profitable that he rarely practiced medicine, spending his days managing his fortune and the estates he purchased with it. He was a large man, eventually weighing over 300 pounds, known for his temper but also for his acuity in reading character. Patients claimed he could diagnose their ailments simply by observing their manner. Charles's mother, Susanna, was the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, founder of the famous pottery dynasty. The Wedgwoods were industrialists, part of the new wealth of the Industrial Revolution, and the marriage between Robert Darwin and Susanna Wedgwood united two prosperous families. Susanna brought not just money but connections, culture, and a tradition of religious dissent. The Wedgwoods were Unitarians, part of that progressive strand of Christianity that rejected the Trinity and emphasized reason in religion. Charles's paternal grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, physician, inventor, and poet, a man of enormous girth and enormous ambition who had died 7 years before Charles was born. Erasmus had written Zoonomia, a sprawling work that speculated about the transformation of species, about life changing across generations. He had been part of the Lunar Society, that remarkable circle of Midlands industrialists and thinkers who gathered monthly at the full moon to discuss science, technology, and progress. Though Charles never knew him, Erasmus's spirit of inquiry would haunt the family. The mount was filled with books, with specimens collected on country walks, with the tools and habits of an educated family. Charles grew up surrounded by older siblings. His brother Erasmus, 4 years older, would become his closest companion. His sisters Caroline, Susan, and Catherine managed the household and oversaw the younger children's education with the seriousness that Victorian women of their class brought to such duties. As a small boy, Charles was curious about everything. He collected shells and minerals and birds' eggs. He watched insects with patient attention. The countryside around Shrewsbury became his laboratory, the river his classroom. He learned the names of birds, the habits of fish, the seasons of wildflowers. He was not a brilliant student of books, but a brilliant observer of the world. But when Charles was 8 years old, the centre of his world disappeared. In July of 1817, Susanna Darwin died. The cause was probably peritonitis, an infection of the abdominal cavity that Victorian medicine could do nothing to treat. She was 52 years old. Charles would later say that he could barely remember her, that his memory of his mother had faded almost completely. This forgetting was perhaps his way of managing the grief. He retained only fragments, her deathbed, her black work table. The single image of her that remained clear was of her in her black velvet gown, which suggests that even the one memory he kept was of her in mourning dress. The loss reshaped the household. Robert Darwin, that large and formidable man, never remarried. He withdrew further into his study and his business affairs. The 3 older sisters, Caroline, Susan, and Catherine, took over the mothering of Charles and his younger sister Emily. They were kind but strict, determined that the children would be raised properly despite the absence of their mother. Charles learned early to navigate the moods of his father and the expectations of his sisters, to avoid confrontation, to keep his own counsel. But he never stopped watching the world around him. The fields and woods and river of Shropshire remained his consolation and his education. He was becoming what he would always be, a naturalist, though that word meant something different then than it does now. It meant a gentleman who studied nature as recreation and discipline, who collected and classified for the love of understanding, not for professional advancement. It was a perfectly respectable occupation for a boy of his class. At age 9, Charles was sent as a day student to a nearby school run by a Unitarian minister. But within a year, though the Mount was less than a mile from the school, he was enrolled as a boarder at Shrewsbury School, where he would spend the next 7 years learning Latin and Greek and very little else. The experience would prove one of the great wastes of his youth, and the beginning of a pattern. Charles Darwin would spend much of his young life being trained for careers he did not want, in systems that nearly destroyed his love of learning. But somehow, against all odds, that love survived. Shrewsbury School in the 1820s was everything Victorian education could be at its worst. The headmaster, Samuel Butler, was a classical scholar of formidable reputation and limited imagination. The curriculum consisted almost entirely of Latin and Greek grammar, classical authors, some mathematics, and nothing that touched the natural world. Boys rose early for chapel, attended lessons that drilled ancient languages into their heads through repetition and fear, and spent their leisure time in the rough hierarchies of boarding school life. Charles hated it. He found the classics boring, the mathematics incomprehensible, the whole enterprise pointless. Years later, he would write, "Nothing could have been worse for the development of my mind than Dr. Butler's school, as it was strictly classical, nothing else being taught except a little ancient geography and history. The school as a means of education to me was simply a blank." Yet he was not stupid or lazy. While his teachers despaired of him, calling him an ordinary boy, perhaps even below average in intelligence, Charles was conducting his own education. He read travel books and natural history in the school library. He continued his childhood hobby of collecting beetles, minerals and shells. With his brother Erasmus, he set up a chemistry laboratory in a tool shed at the Mount, spending hours mixing compounds and heating substances to see what would happen. The other boys nicknamed him Gas for his chemical experiments. He discovered shooting. The sport of gentlemen, hunting game birds in the fields and woods, became an obsession. He kept meticulous records of every bird he shot, and through shooting he learned fieldcraft, how to observe animal behaviour, how to move quietly through the landscape, how to read the signs of weather and season. These skills, learned in pursuit of sport, would later prove essential to his scientific work. But academically he remained a disappointment. His father looked at his lack of progress and saw a boy wasting his advantages. Robert had assumed that Charles would follow him into medicine, that the Darwin tradition of physicians would continue into another generation. In 1825, when Charles was 16, Robert made a decision. He pulled Charles out of Shrewsbury School and sent him north to Edinburgh University with Erasmus to study medicine. If Robert hoped that Edinburgh would transform his son, he was to be disappointed. But the city would transform Charles in ways his father could never have imagined, exposing him to ideas that would have scandalised Shrewsbury School and setting him on the path toward the work that would define his life. Edinburgh in the 1820s was one of the intellectual capitals of Britain, the Athens of the North, home to a university that had trained physicians for generations. Its medical school was considered among the finest in the world. Young men came from across Britain and Europe to learn anatomy and surgery, to attend the lectures of famous professors, to walk the wards of the Royal Infirmary. Charles and Erasmus arrived in the autumn of 1825 and found lodgings in Lothian Street, in the old town not far from the university. Charles was 16 years old, away from home for the first time in any meaningful way. In a grey northern city of steep streets and tall buildings and winds that blew cold off the North Sea. He attended his lectures. He tried to learn the material, but from the beginning it was clear that medicine was not for him. The medical education of that era was brutal in ways that are difficult to imagine now. There was no anaesthesia. Surgical operations were performed on conscious, screaming patients held down by strong assistants. Students were expected to observe these procedures as part of their training. Charles attended 2 operations on children. The screaming, the blood, the horror of watching surgery performed on unanesthetized bodies, especially children, traumatized him. He rushed from the operating theatre and never returned. The memory haunted him for the rest of his life. Years later, he would write that these scenes haunted his dreams. Whatever career he might have, it would not be medicine. The formal lectures bored him. Anatomy was taught through rote memorization. The professor of medicine, Dr. Duncan, delivered his lectures in such a monotonous drone that Charles could barely stay awake. Geology was taught by Professor Jameson, who managed to make the history of the Earth seem as dull as a phone book. Charles later recalled that Jameson's lectures convinced him that geology was the driest subject imaginable, a judgment he would later revise dramatically. But Edinburgh offered other educations, informal ones that he pursued with much more interest. He joined student societies. He attended meetings of the Plinian Society, a student natural history group where undergraduates presented papers and debated the latest scientific ideas. It was here, in these evening meetings, that Charles first encountered ideas that would have horrified his father and shocked polite society. One member, a student named William Brown, presented a paper arguing that the mind was merely the product of the brain, that consciousness arose from matter and died with the body. The idea directly contradicted religious teachings about the immortal soul. The Plinian Society was so alarmed that they struck the presentation from their minutes. But Charles had heard it. The seed was planted. Perhaps everything could be explained by natural causes. Perhaps there was no need for divine intervention in the workings of life and mind. More importantly, Charles met Robert Grant, a radical young lecturer and physician who became his first real scientific mentor. Grant was studying marine invertebrates, the primitive creatures that lived in tide pools and shallow waters, sponges and sea mats and tiny swimming things. Grant believed in the transmutation of species, the idea that life forms could change across generations, that species were not fixed since creation but mutable. This was a dangerous idea in 1820s Britain, associated with French materialism and political radicalism. Grant took Charles along on collecting expeditions to the rocky shores of the Firth of Forth. They would wade into tide pools, gather specimens, bring them back to Grant's rooms for examination under microscopes. Charles learned how to dissect, how to observe carefully, how to see. He made his own small discoveries. He found that the tiny black specks in oyster shells were the larvae of a marine creature, the first observation he would ever publish in print. Grant shared his radical ideas with Charles during their walks. He spoke of Lamarck, the French naturalist who argued that animals changed across generations, acquiring traits through use and passing them on to offspring. He spoke of the evidence that life had a history, that the present forms were descendants of different ancient forms. He praised Erasmus Darwin's zoonomia, Charles's own grandfather's speculations about the transformation of life. Charles listened but did not commit. He was curious but cautious. The ideas were fascinating and forbidden. He filed them away, these dangerous thoughts, without fully accepting or rejecting them. After 2 years in Edinburgh, it was clear to both Charles and his father that medicine was not going to work. Charles had learned natural history, made connections, discovered what fascinated him, but he had not progressed toward a medical degree and had no intention of doing so. Robert Darwin was frustrated and worried. His son was now 19 years old with no clear profession, no direction, no future. Robert made another decision. Charles would become a clergyman. The Church of England offered respectable positions for younger sons of good families, livings that provided comfortable incomes without demanding too much in the way of spiritual intensity. A rural parish would give Charles a house, a salary, and plenty of time to pursue his natural history interests as a hobby. It was a perfectly acceptable life for a gentleman naturalist. Charles agreed. He had no particular religious doubts at the time. He accepted the basic teachings of the church, and the prospect of a quiet country life, studying nature while performing the minimal duties of a country parson, sounded far more pleasant than bleeding patients or cutting into screaming children. So in 1828, at age 19, Charles Darwin went up to Cambridge to study for holy orders, to prepare himself for a life in the church. It was, in a sense, a career of last resort, the fallback position for a wealthy young man who had failed at everything else. What no one could have known was that Cambridge would be the making of him, not through its official curriculum, but through the men he would meet and the opportunities that would arise from those friendships. The church would wait. The world was the calling. Christ's College, Cambridge, in the late 1820s was a place where young gentlemen learned just enough theology and classics to eventually take up comfortable livings in country parishes. Charles Darwin arrived in January 1828, assigned rooms in a corner of the college's second court, overlooking ancient stone walls and manicured lawns. He was supposed to study divinity, to prepare for ordination in the Church of England. The curriculum required him to master Greek and Latin texts, including the New Testament in the original language, and to read William Paley's works on natural theology and Christian evidences. Paley argued that the complexity and beauty of nature proved the existence of a divine designer, just as the discovery of a watch on a heath would prove the existence of a watchmaker. Charles found Paley's arguments beautiful and persuasive. The idea that every adaptation in nature, from the eye of an eagle to the wing of a butterfly, demonstrated divine craftsmanship appealed to his love of natural history while fitting neatly into Orthodox Christianity. He would later use the same observations to argue the opposite conclusion, that these adaptations arose not from design but from the blind mechanism of natural selection. But that insight was still years away. He attended the required lectures. He passed his examinations, ranking 10th out of 178 students, who took the ordinary degree in January 1831. It was a respectable performance, better than his teachers at Shrewsbury could have hoped. But the official curriculum was again the least important part of his education. What mattered at Cambridge were the friendships he formed and the world they opened to him. Charles joined the sporting set, the young men who hunted and drank and rode horses. He became an enthusiastic hunter, shooting game birds and keeping detailed records of his kills. He played cards and attended wine parties. He lived the life of a wealthy undergraduate, enjoying the freedoms and pleasures his class and circumstances permitted. But he also fell in with a different circle, the men who studied nature seriously. He began attending lectures on botany and geology, subjects not required for his degree but fascinating to him. He collected beetles with obsessive enthusiasm, spending hours searching under bark and in fields for rare specimens. His cousin William Darwin Fox shared this passion, and together they would compare finds and trade specimens. Charles later recalled that no poet ever enjoyed poetry more intensely than he enjoyed finding a rare beetle. One story from this period reveals both his enthusiasm and his quick thinking. One day, He tore bark from a dead tree and found 2 rare beetles. He grabbed one in each hand. Then he spotted a 3rd rare species and, not wanting to lose it, popped one of the beetles in his mouth to free a hand. The beetle he had swallowed promptly excreted an acidic liquid, burning his tongue so severely that he had to spit it out. He lost both that beetle and the 3rd one he was reaching for. But the story spread through Cambridge's naturalist community. Here was a young man who cared about beetles enough to eat one. The most important person Charles met at Cambridge was not a famous professor, but a mild-mannered botanist named John Stevens Henslow. Henslow was only 37 years old, recently appointed to the chair of botany, and he had made it his practice to hold Friday evening gatherings at his home where undergraduates interested in natural science could meet, discuss, and learn. Charles began attending these gatherings. He and Henslow became close. They took long walks together through the Cambridge countryside, discussing plants and insects and the latest scientific controversies. The other students nicknamed Charles the man who walks with Henslow, a mark of special favour. Henslow saw in Charles something that his other teachers had missed. Not brilliance in the classroom, but a keen eye, a careful mind, and an insatiable curiosity about the natural world. Henslow taught Charles to observe rigorously, to collect methodically, to think about what he saw. He introduced him to the latest developments in botany and geology, and he encouraged Charles to pursue science not just as recreation, but as serious work. When Charles confessed his ignorance of certain subjects, Henslow didn't judge. He lent books, explained concepts, and made Charles feel that asking questions was not a sign of stupidity, but the beginning of wisdom. Another mentor emerged in Charles's final year at Cambridge. Professor Adam Sedgwick was one of Britain's leading geologists, a brilliant field researcher who could read the history of the Earth in the layers of rock. In the summer of 1831, after Charles had completed his examinations but before he had officially left Cambridge, Sedgwick invited him on a geological field trip to North Wales. They spent 2 weeks mapping rock, formations, collecting fossils, and learning to see the landscape as a record of deep time. Sedgwick taught Charles how to use a clinometer to measure the angle of rock strata, how to identify different types of stone, how to reason backward from present evidence to past events. It was rigorous training in scientific method, in how to observe and record and interpret. Charles returned from Wales in late August 1831, tanned and tired and filled with new knowledge. He expected to spend the next few months preparing for his ordination, then to settle into some quiet parish where he would read sermons on Sundays and collect beetles the rest of the week. Waiting for him at the Mount was a letter that would change everything. The letter was from Henslow, forwarded from Cambridge. Charles opened it with casual curiosity and found an offer that seemed impossible, an invitation to circumnavigate the globe. HMS Beagle was a small naval vessel, 90 feet long and 24 feet wide, preparing for a surveying expedition to map the coastlines of South America, and then to continue around the world. The captain, Robert Fitzroy, wanted a gentleman companion who could also serve as the ship's naturalist, someone to collect specimens and make observations while the crew conducted their maritime surveys. Fitzroy was only 26 years old, an aristocrat and a brilliant navigator who suffered from dark depressions. He wanted someone of his own social class to dine with, to talk to during the long months at sea, someone who would not be bound by the formal hierarchies of naval command. Henslow had been offered the position first and had declined, having recently married. But he immediately thought of Charles. He wrote, "I have stated that I consider you to be the best qualified person I know of who is likely to undertake such a situation. I state this not on the supposition of your being a finished naturalist, but as amply qualified for collecting, observing and noting anything worthy to be noted in natural history." Charles was electrified. Here was the chance to see the tropics he had read about in travel books, to study natural history not in the hedgerows of Shropshire, but in the rainforests and mountains of South America. Everything in his education had been pointing toward this moment. The chemistry experiments with Erasmus, the marine invertebrates with Grant, the beetles at Cambridge, the geology in Wales. This was what he wanted to do. But there was one enormous problem. His father would never agree. Robert Darwin was appalled when Charles brought him the letter. At 62 years old and weighing over 300 pounds, Robert was an imposing figure whose word was law in the Darwin household. He had spent decades building a successful medical practice, accumulating wealth, and planning his children's futures. Charles's proposal seemed like another example of his third son's inability to settle down and accept adult responsibility. Robert could see no benefit to the voyage. Charles was supposed to enter the church. He had studied theology at Cambridge for exactly this purpose. In a few months he should be seeking a curacy, beginning the path to his own parish. Instead, he wanted to spend 2 years, the planned duration of the voyage, sailing around the world collecting beetles and rocks. How would this help him as a country clergyman? What congregation would respect a parson who had wasted years chasing butterflies in South America? The dangers were real and frightening. Ships sank regularly. The naval casualty lists published in newspapers told of vessels lost in storms, wrecked on rocks, burned by fire. Tropical diseases killed Europeans by the thousands. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, all claimed victims among travellers to hot climates. Robert had seen patients die of tropical fevers contracted in the West Indies. He knew the risks. Moreover, the voyage seemed like another in a series of false starts and abandoned careers. Charles had failed at medicine. He had scraped through his theology degree without any real enthusiasm. Now he wanted to postpone his clerical career for an adventure that served no practical purpose. To Robert, who valued industry, perseverance, and practical achievement, it looked like his son was running away from responsibility once again. Robert laid out his objections systematically. The voyage would be disreputable to Charles's character as a clergyman. It would be a useless undertaking. Charles might just as well go to the West Indies, which would be cheaper and safer. The accommodation aboard a small naval vessel would be uncomfortable for a gentleman. It was a wild scheme. Robert concluded with devastating finality. If Charles could find one man of common sense who would advise him to go, Robert would give his consent. Otherwise, the answer was no. Charles was heartbroken. He had no argument against his father's practical objections. He had no independent income. The Beagle position paid nothing, merely offered passage and provisions. He would need his father's financial support for equipment, for clothing suitable for tropical climates, for all the expenses of a long voyage. Without Robert's permission, the dream was impossible. That evening, Charles wrote to Henslow declining the offer. He explained that his father's objections were insurmountable. He tried to sound philosophical about it, but the disappointment bled through his words. The opportunity of a lifetime was slipping away because he could not convince his father that collecting tropical beetles was more valuable than becoming a country vicar. The next morning, Charles went shooting at Mayor Hall, the estate of his uncle Josiah Wedgwood II. The two families were intimately connected. Josiah was Robert's brother-in-law, married to Robert's sister Elizabeth. The Wedgwood and Darwin families had been intermarrying for generations, both descended from the wealthy industrial class that had prospered during Britain's transformation. Josiah was a shrewd businessman who managed the famous Wedgwood pottery works and a liberal-minded man who valued education and progress. Charles poured out his frustration while they walked the grounds with their guns. He explained Henslow's offer, his father's objections, and his own desperate desire to go. Josiah listened carefully. Unlike Robert, he saw the voyage not as a distraction, but as an opportunity for education and advancement. A young gentleman who had sailed around the world, who had studied natural history on multiple continents, who had seen the wonders of the tropics, would have something unique to contribute. He would have experience and knowledge that few clergymen, or indeed few gentlemen of any profession, could match. Josiah made Charles an offer. He would drive Charles back to Shrewsbury the next morning and speak to Robert personally. More importantly, he would write a systematic response to each of Robert's objections. If Robert had said he needed one man of common sense to approve the voyage, Josiah would be that man. They returned to Shrewsbury on September 1st. Josiah sat with Robert and methodically addressed each concern. Would the voyage hurt Charles's character? No. The company would be respectable naval officers. Would it be useless? No. Natural history was increasingly important to educated men. Would it interfere with his clerical prospects? No. The voyage would give him maturity and experience. The dangers, they were real but manageable, and young men faced risks in many pursuits. Robert Darwin was not an unreasonable man. He was protective and practical, but he was not a tyrant. When his respected brother-in-law, a man whose judgment he trusted, endorsed the scheme, Robert reconsidered. Perhaps he had been too hasty. Perhaps this voyage might actually benefit Charles rather than ruin him. Robert's resistance crumbled. He gave his permission. More than that, he promised to fund Charles's expenses, buying the equipment and clothing his son would need. Charles was free to accept Henslow's offer. The voyage was on. Charles rode to Cambridge immediately to tell Henslow, then hurried to London to meet Captain Fitzroy. The meeting nearly ended the whole adventure before it began. Fitzroy was a believer in physiognomy, the pseudoscience that claimed you could judge character from facial features. When he saw Charles, he almost rejected him on the spot. The shape of Charles's nose, Fitzroy thought, indicated a lack of sufficient energy and determination for the voyage. But they talked for hours, and Fitzroy's doubts faded. Charles was enthusiastic, educated, and clearly a gentleman. They could dine together without awkwardness. Fitzroy offered him the position. Charles accepted. On December 27th, 1831, after delays for weather and final preparations, HMS Beagle finally departed from Plymouth. Charles was 22 years old. He had no formal scientific training, no position at a university, no published research. He was a gentleman naturalist embarking on what he assumed would be a pleasant 2-year collecting trip before settling into a country parish. The voyage would actually last nearly 5 years. And by the time Charles Darwin returned to England in October 1836, everything would have changed. The pleasant collecting trip would become the foundation for a revolution in human understanding. The young man who left England believing in the fixity of species would return harbouring doubts that would eventually overturn that belief entirely. But first, he had to survive the voyage, and for the first month at sea, survival seemed very much in question. Charles Darwin was a terrible sailor. From the moment HMS Beagle left Plymouth and hit the open ocean, he was seasick. Not just queasy, but violently, miserably ill. He spent the first weeks of the voyage lying in his hammock in the chart room, unable to eat, barely able to move, vomiting repeatedly. The ship's motion, the confined quarters, the smell of bilge water and tar and unwashed men, everything conspired to make him wretched. His hammock hung in the poop cabin at the stern of the ship, a space about 10 feet by 11 feet that he shared with 2 other officers. The ceiling was so low he could not stand upright. His belongings were crammed into every available space. Books, preserving bottles, specimen boxes, microscopes, geological tools, nets for catching marine creatures. Captain Fitzroy had given him permission to bring whatever he needed for his work, and Charles had interpreted this generously. The Beagle was a tiny ship for such an ambitious voyage. Its crew numbered about 74 men, packed into a vessel barely longer than a cricket pitch. There were sailors and marines, officers and specialists, all living in cramped quarters that smelled of sweat and salt and tar. On deck, cannons and equipment left little room to move. Below deck, hammocks swung so close together that men could barely turn without touching. Fitzroy was an exacting captain, brilliant but volatile, prone to rages that cleared the deck and to depressions that sent him to his cabin for days. He was a Tory of aristocratic family, deeply religious, convinced that the Bible was literally true and that science would ultimately confirm every word of Genesis. He and Charles would spend the voyage arguing about slavery, religion, and the interpretation of geological evidence. Arguments that sometimes grew so heated that Charles feared for his position aboard the ship. But Fitzroy also respected scientific inquiry and gave Charles freedom to collect whatever interested him. At every landing, while the crew conducted their surveys, Charles was allowed to go ashore for days or weeks at a time, sometimes with 1 or 2 crew members to help carry equipment and specimens, sometimes with local guides hired for the purpose. The seasickness never entirely left him, though it improved, slightly as the voyage progressed. Years later he would write that he had spent the voyage in varying degrees of misery. In calm weather he could work. In rough weather he could only lie in his hammock and wish for death. This chronic illness aboard ship meant that he came to dread the sea. Every time they departed one port for another, he knew days or weeks of suffering awaited him. Conversely, every landfall was a liberation. The Beagle's route took them first to the Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa, where Charles made his first important geological observation. The island of Santiago had a white cliff band running horizontally at about 45 feet above sea level. The band was filled with shells and coral fragments, clearly the remains of an ancient seabed, but it was now well above the ocean. The land must have risen, or the sea must have fallen. Either way, the earth was not static, it changed across time. Charles had brought with him the first volume of Lyell's Principles of Geology, a book that was revolutionizing the study of the earth. Lyell argued that the present was the key to the past, that the same geological processes operating today, erosion, volcanism, sedimentation, had been operating for countless ages and had gradually shaped the world we see. There was no need for catastrophes or divine interventions. Slow, uniform processes given enough time could raise mountains and carve canyons. The evidence at Santiago seemed to confirm Lyell's view. Charles was electrified. Here was a way of reading the landscape, of seeing the earth not as created in its present form, but as constantly changing across vast stretches of time. He would spend much of the voyage testing and extending Lyell's ideas. From the Cape Verde Islands, the Beagle crossed the Atlantic to South America, where they would spend the next 3 years. The ship anchored at Salvador, then called Bahia, on the coast of Brazil in late February 1832. Charles went ashore and entered the rainforest for the first time. He was overwhelmed. The diversity of life in the tropical forest staggered him. Thousands of species of insects, hundreds of kinds of plants, birds of unimaginable colours, all crowded together in a green cathedral of vegetation. He collected frantically, trying to preserve specimens of everything that caught his eye, but the heat and humidity destroyed many samples before he could preserve them properly. It was a learning experience in the practical difficulties of tropical collecting. The Brazilian coast also exposed Charles to the reality of slavery. Brazil in 1832 was a slave society, and Charles witnessed scenes that revolted him. He saw slaves treated as property, beaten, sold, separated from their families. He came from an abolitionist family. Both Darwins and Wedgwoods had campaigned against slavery for generations, and seeing it firsthand made him furious. He and Fitzroy nearly came to blows over the issue. Fitzroy defended slavery, arguing that many slaves were content with their condition. Charles exploded, pointing out that asking a slave in front of his master if he wanted to be free was meaningless. Fitzroy ordered Charles to leave the cabin. For days they did not speak. Fitzroy eventually apologised, but the argument revealed the gulf between them. They could be friends, but their fundamental views of the world were incompatible. The Beagle continued down the South American coast, stopping at Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, and then Buenos Aires. At each port, Charles went inland whenever possible, making excursions that lasted days or weeks. He saw the vast grasslands of the Pampas, where gauchos herded cattle and hunted ostriches with bolas. Weighted ropes they hurled with astonishing accuracy. The gauchos lived a hard life, sleeping on the ground under the stars, eating meat roasted over open fires, travelling for days across grasslands that seemed endless. Charles joined them on some of their expeditions, learning to ride for hours without rest, to navigate by the stars and the position of the sun, to read the landscape for water and shelter. He observed how the rheas, large flightless birds similar to ostriches, would run when approached, their long legs carrying them across the plains at remarkable speed. The gauchos told him of two different kinds of rheas, the common rhea and a smaller species that lived further south. Charles collected specimens of both, though one particularly memorable rhea was partially eaten at dinner before someone realised it was the rare species Charles had been hoping to find. He frantically saved what remained of the carcass for scientific study. He collected fossils of giant extinct mammals, enormous ground sloths and massive armadillo-like creatures that had once roamed these plains but were now gone. At Punta Alta, he worked for days in the cliff face, carefully excavating bones from the hard sedimentary rock. The work was back-breaking. He had to chip away at the matrix surrounding each bone, working in the heat of the Argentine sun, plagued by flies and the constant wind that blew dust into his eyes and mouth. These fossils fascinated him. The extinct creatures were similar to modern animals, but larger and often bizarre in their proportions. The giant ground sloths resembled modern tree sloths, but were the size of elephants, with massive claws that suggested they pulled down tree branches to feed. The ancient armadillos, which he named Glyptodon, were similar to modern armadillos but as big as automobiles, their shells composed of interlocking bony plates that formed an almost impenetrable armour. There were toxodons, hippopotamus-like mammals with strange teeth unlike anything living today. There were macrochinia, camel-like creatures with trunks like elephants. Why would God create these creatures and then allow them to go extinct? And why would he then create similar but smaller creatures to replace them? If the extinct forms were imperfect and needed replacement, why would the new forms be so similar to the old? If the extinct forms were perfect for their time, why would conditions change to make them unsuitable? The patterns seem to suggest not separate acts of creation, but some kind of relationship across time, as if the modern animals were descended from the ancient ones, transformed gradually across countless generations. Charles packed the fossils carefully, wrapping them in paper and cloth, and shipped them back to England in crates. He could not know that these bones would make him famous among British scientists even before the Beagle returned home, that Richard Owen would study them and declare them remarkable discoveries, or that they would eventually form part of the evidence for his theory of evolution. In September 1832, at Punta Alta near Bahia Blanca in Argentina, Charles made one of his most important fossil discoveries. In the cliffs he found the bones of at least 6 different species of extinct large mammals. He spent days carefully excavating them, wrapping them, and sending them back to England. These fossils would later be studied by the leading anatomist Richard Owen and would make Charles famous in scientific circles even before the Beagle returned home. The voyage was not all scientific discovery. There were moments of danger and adventure. In Uruguay, Charles joined a party of armed sailors sent ashore to reclaim a fort that rebels had seized. In Patagonia, he met General Juan Manuel de Rosas and his private army, engaged in a war of extermination against the indigenous peoples of the region. Charles was disturbed by the brutality he witnessed, the casual violence of frontier life, the treatment of native peoples as vermin to be eradicated. But mostly the voyage was work. Endless collecting, preserving, cataloguing and shipping specimens back to England. Charles sent back crate after crate of carefully labelled materials, birds, insects, plants, fossils, rocks. He filled notebooks with observations, sketches, measurements. He wrote letters to Henslow describing his findings and asking for advice. Henslow, back in Cambridge, began reading some of Charles's letters to scientific societies, and Charles's reputation began to grow. In December 1832, the Beagle rounded the stormy southern tip of South America, Cape Horn, one of the most dangerous passages in the world. They reached Tierra del Fuego in the depth of southern summer, which was cold and miserable by any standard. Here Fitzroy had a personal mission. On his previous voyage, he had taken 4 Fuegians back to England to be educated. One had died, but the other 3, including 2 men nicknamed Jemmy Button and York Minster, and a young woman called Fuegia Basket, were now being returned to their homeland, with supplies and missionary training, part of Fitzroy's plan to bring Christianity and civilization to the region. The experiment was a disaster. Within months of being left, the educated Fuegians had returned to their former way of life, and the mission station Fitzroy established was abandoned. Charles, observing the indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego, was struck by how different they seemed from the English in culture and technology. Yet they were clearly the same species, capable of being educated as the 3 Fuegians had demonstrated. What separated them from the English was not biology, but circumstance and history. The Beagle spent 1833 and 1834 surveying the eastern and western coasts of South America. Charles made a trip inland across the Argentine Pampas on horseback, living like a gaucho, sleeping under the stars, learning to hunt with bolas. He crossed into the foothills of the Andes Mountains and later climbed high into the range, collecting fossils of marine shells at 12,000 feet above sea level. The shells proved that these mountains had once been under the sea. The Andes, Lyell's most dramatic example of geological uplift, were rising from the ocean floor. In February 1835, while the Beagle was anchored at Valdivia on the Chilean coast, Charles was lying in a forest when the ground began to shake. He experienced his first earthquake, a violent tremor that destroyed the town of Concepcion 100 miles to the north. Later, visiting the ruined city, he saw how the earthquake had raised the coastline by several feet. He found beds of mussels and seaweed now high and dry above the high tide line. The earth had risen perceptibly during a single event. This was Lyellian geology in action. Mountains were not created in a single moment of divine will. They were pushed up by countless earthquakes across millions of years. The earth was ancient, dynamic, and its present form was the product of slow processes acting over vast stretches of time. Charles was now a convinced uniformitarian, a believer in Lyell's vision of deep time and gradual change. By September 1835, the Beagle had completed most of its survey work in South America. Fitzroy plotted a course northwest across the Pacific, heading for a group of volcanic islands that had been discovered by whalers, a place of fire and strange creatures that few naturalists had ever visited. The Galápagos Islands appeared on the horizon on September 15, 1835. Charles could see the volcanic peaks rising from the sea, dark and forbidding against the blue Pacific. These islands would give him the evidence he needed to begin formulating the most revolutionary idea in the history of biology, though he would not realise it for more than a year. The HMS Beagle anchored off Chatham Island, now called San Cristobal, on September 16, 1835. Charles went ashore and stepped into a landscape that seemed primordial, almost lunar. Black lava fields stretched in every direction, barely covered with scrubby vegetation. The heat was intense. The rocks absorbed the equatorial sun and radiated it back like an oven. And everywhere there were creatures unlike anything he had seen before. Giant tortoises plodded slowly across the landscape, some weighing hundreds of pounds, their shells domed or saddleback-shaped depending on their island. Marine iguanas, looking like miniature dragons, basked on the volcanic rocks or swam in the surf, the only lizards in the world that feed in the sea. Land iguanas in bright yellows and oranges dug burrows in the dusty soil. Mockingbirds hopped tamely around the visitors, curious and unafraid. Finches of various sizes pecked at seeds or insects, their beaks varying noticeably in size and shape. The animals showed no fear of humans. The tortoises barely withdrew into their shells when Charles approached. The birds landed on water containers and on the shoulders of sailors. It was as if the animals had never learned that humans were dangerous. Charles found it both delightful and scientifically significant. This fearlessness suggested that these creatures had evolved in isolation, without large predators, and had no instinctive fear of unfamiliar animals. The Beagle spent 5 weeks in the Galápagos, visiting several of the islands. Charles collected specimens wherever they landed. He shot mockingbirds and finches for study. He watched the tortoises and iguanas. He collected plants and insects. The islands were a naturalist's laboratory, each one slightly different from the others, each with its own varieties of the same basic creatures. The vice-governor of the islands, an Englishman named Nicholas Lawson, mentioned to Charles that he could tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. The tortoises on islands with abundant vegetation had domed shells. Those on drier islands, where the tortoises had to reach up to eat cactus pads, had saddleback shells that allowed them to extend their necks higher. Charles found this interesting but did not yet grasp its full implications. He did notice that the mockingbirds were different on different islands. On Chatham Island, the mockingbirds had one appearance. On Charles Island, now called Floriana, they looked slightly different. On James Island, they were different again. Charles carefully labelled these mockingbird specimens by island, but he failed to do the same with the finches, thinking they were not particularly important and that they might not even all be finches. Some, he thought, might be wrens or blackbirds. This was one of the great ironies of scientific history. The birds that would later be called Darwin's finches and become the most famous example of evolution in action were barely noticed by Darwin at the time. He collected them carelessly, not labelling most by island, thinking they were a mixed collection of different bird families that had somehow reached the islands from the mainland. The volcanic nature of the islands fascinated him. These were not ancient lands, but relatively young formations pushed up from the ocean floor by volcanic activity. Some of the lava flows were clearly very recent, barely weathered. How had all these creatures arrived on such remote islands, 600 miles from the South American mainland? And why were they similar to South American species, but distinctly different? Why would God create unique species for these remote islands, rather than simply placing South American species there? Charles spent 9 days camped on James Island, with the ship's surgeon Benjamin Bino and their servants collecting intensively. He caught more mockingbirds, observed the finches without understanding their significance, watched the marine iguanas feeding on seaweed underwater, and marvelled at the tameness of everything. He shipped crates of specimens back to the Beagle. On October 20th, 1835, the Beagle raised anchor and sailed west toward Tahiti. Charles was not sorry to leave. He found the Galapagos interesting but harsh, hot and uncomfortable, lacking the lush beauty of the Brazilian rainforest. He didn't have a sudden revelation about evolution while standing on volcanic rock. He did not yet understand what he had seen, but he had collected the evidence. The carefully labelled mockingbirds, the carelessly collected finches, the observations about tortoises and islands, all of it was packed away in crates and notebooks. When he returned to England and began examining these specimens with the help of expert naturalists, the patterns would emerge. The Galapagos would retrospectively become the most important stop of the entire voyage. The Beagle continued westward across the Pacific, stopping at Tahiti, then New Zealand, then Australia. They crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and finally turned north toward England. In October 1836, nearly 5 years after departing, the Beagle anchored at Falmouth in Cornwall. Charles Darwin stepped ashore in England for the first time since 1831. He was 27 years old. He had travelled around the world. He had collected thousands of specimens. He had made his name as a geologist and naturalist. Henslow had been reading his letters to scientific societies, and Charles was already somewhat famous in British scientific circles before he returned. But he had also changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had seen the diversity of life on an extraordinary scale. He had observed patterns that did not fit with the standard story of creation. He had collected evidence that would trouble him for the rest of his life and eventually force him to a conclusion so radical that he would delay publishing it for 20 years. Charles Darwin returned from the Beagle voyage as a famous geologist and an ambitious naturalist. But he would spend the next 2 decades becoming something else entirely. A revolutionary who would change forever how humanity understood its place in nature. But first, he had to get married, settle down, and begin the careful work of examining what he had brought back from his 5 years at sea. The life that Charles Darwin established after the Beagle voyage returned him to England's shores, settled into a pattern that would define his existence for the next 4 decades. Within 2 years of his return, he made 2 of the most important decisions of his life. He married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and he began systematically developing a theory that he knew would horrify her and shock the world. The marriage was a calculation wrapped in affection. Charles was 29 years old in 1838, established as a scientist and needing to decide how to organise his life. He made lists, an endearing habit that reveals his methodical mind. On one side of the page he wrote the advantages of marriage: a constant companion, someone to care for the house, children, if it please God, an object to be beloved and played with, better than a dog anyhow, someone to take care of house, charms of music and female, chit-chat, these things good for one's health. On the other side, the disadvantages: terrible loss of time, cannot read in the evenings, fatness and idleness, anxiety and responsibility, less money for books, forced to visit relatives and bend in every trifle, perhaps quarrelling, loss of freedom to go where one liked. How should I manage all my business if I were obliged to go every day walking with my wife? He concluded that marriage was the better choice, writing at the bottom of his list, marry, 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 QED. But the question was whom to marry. Emma Wedgwood was the obvious candidate. She was his first cousin, the daughter of his uncle Josiah, who had helped convince his father to let him join the Beagle. Charles had known Emma since childhood. They had played together as children at Mire, the Wedgwood estate. She was 9 years old when he was born, and he remembered her kindness to him as a child. She was intelligent, having been educated by the same governess who had taught Chopin and was an accomplished pianist. She was kind, sensible, and came from a family he already loved. Most importantly, she knew him well enough to understand his peculiarities and accept them. Charles proposed in November 1838 during a visit to Mare. Emma accepted, though not without some concern about his religious views, which she sensed were changing. They married on January 29, 1839, at the Anglican church in Mare Village. Emma was 30 years old, an older bride by Victorian standards. Charles was 29. The wedding was small and quiet, attended only by family members. They honeymooned briefly in London before settling into their new life together. Emma was also deeply religious, far more devout than Charles. She was a Unitarian, her faith grounded in reason and conscience, but nonetheless sincere and important to her. She believed in God, in the afterlife, in the moral teachings of Christianity. Charles, who had once intended to become a clergyman, was already having serious doubts about Christianity by the time he married Emma. He had seen too much on the Beagle voyage that troubled him: the cruelty of slaveholders who claimed Christian faith, the extinction of species that seemed to contradict divine providence, the suffering of innocent animals that raised questions about a benevolent creator. He kept these doubts largely to himself at first, but Emma sensed them. In an early letter to Charles, written shortly after their engagement, she confessed her concern that his scientific work was leading him away from faith. She worried for his soul, feared they would be separated in the afterlife if he lost his belief. This would become a source of quiet pain between them for their entire marriage. Emma worried for his salvation. Charles worried about causing her distress. They learned to navigate around the topic, to love each other despite their differences, to respect each other's convictions, even when those convictions were irreconcilable. They settled, first in London, in a house on Gower Street that Charles rented. He was working furiously to organise and describe the specimens from the Beagle voyage, enlisting the help of the best specialists in Britain. Richard Owen, the country's leading anatomist, was examining the fossil mammals. John Gould, an expert ornithologist, was identifying the birds. Thomas Bell was working on the reptiles. Charles was coordinating all of this while also working on his own geological publications. In March 1837, several months before he proposed to Emma, John Gould had reported his findings on the Galápagos birds to the Zoological Society. Gould's news was startling. The mockingbirds from different islands were distinct species, 3 different kinds, each confined to its own island. And the finches, which Charles had thought were a mixed collection of wrens, finches and blackbirds, were actually all finches, 13 distinct species that had evolved from a common ancestor, each adapted to a different way of life in the islands. This hit Charles like a hammer. He had not labelled the finches by island, a collector's mistake that haunted him. But his servant Sims Covington, who had helped him collect, and Captain Fitzroy, who had collected his own specimens, had kept better records. By combining everyone's specimens and notes, the pattern emerged. Each island had its own species of finch. Some ate seeds and had thick, powerful beaks for cracking. Others ate insects and had thin, pointed beaks. Still others ate cactus and had beaks shaped for that purpose. One species even used a cactus spine as a tool to extract insects from bark. Why would the creator design different species for each small island? Why would he give them different beaks for different foods when a single versatile species could have served? The pattern made no sense as design, but it made perfect sense if the finches had arrived from the mainland as a single founding population and then spread to the different islands where they changed across generations to suit local conditions. In July 1837, just over a year after returning from the voyage, Charles opened a notebook and began writing about the transformation of species. At the top, he wrote Zoonomia, a reference to his grandfather Erasmus Darwin's book about evolution. Charles was now seriously considering the idea that his grandfather had only speculated about, that species were not fixed since creation, but changed across time, that all life was related by descent from common ancestors. It was an incredibly dangerous idea. Evolution, or transmutation, as it was then called, was associated with political radicalism, with atheism, with the overturning of the social order. If species were not fixed, if humanity was not specially created but had evolved from lower forms, then the entire foundation of Victorian society was undermined. The Bible's account of creation was wrong. Humanity's special status was an illusion. The aristocracy could not claim divine sanction for their rule. Everything was fluid, mutable, directionless. Charles knew that publishing such an idea without overwhelming evidence would destroy his scientific reputation. He would be dismissed as a crank, a radical, a man who had let ambition override reason. So he wrote in his private notebooks, developing his thoughts, testing hypotheses, accumulating evidence, and telling almost no one what he was thinking. The breakthrough came in September 1838 when he happened to read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population. Malthus argued that human populations grow faster than food supplies, leading to inevitable competition and suffering. The strong survive, the weak perish, and this harsh struggle keeps populations in check. Charles suddenly saw how this applied to all life. Every species produces more offspring than can possibly survive. Every generation is full of variation, some individuals taller, some faster, some with better eyesight. In the struggle for existence, those with advantageous variations are more likely to survive and reproduce. Their traits are passed to the next generation. Over countless generations, this process of natural selection can reshape species, can turn fins into legs, can transform a single ancestral population into the millions of diverse forms we see in nature. It was beautifully simple. It required no divine intervention, no supernatural guidance. It was a law of nature as mechanical and inexorable as gravity. Vary, struggle, survive or die, pass on traits, repeat for millions of years. The result, evolution. Charles had his theory, but he would keep it secret for the next 20 years, working to perfect it, to address every possible objection, to gather so much evidence that even the most skeptical reader would be forced to consider it seriously. He knew that when he finally published, he would be attacking the foundations of everything Victorian England believed about the world and humanity's place in it. In 1842, Charles and Emma moved out of London to a house in the countryside, seeking a quieter life away from the noise and social obligations of the city. The house was called Down House, in the village of Down in Kent, about 16 miles southeast of London. It was a plain but comfortable Georgian house built of brick, with cream-coloured stucco walls and large windows. It sat on 18 acres that included gardens, a greenhouse and a small wood. They would live there for the rest of Charles's life, 40 years, raising their family and transforming the property into both a home and scientific laboratory. The move to Down House coincided with a painful loss. Their daughter Anne Elizabeth, known as Annie, was born in 1841, a bright, affectionate child who Charles adored. She was his favourite, the one who could lift his spirits even when illness confined him to bed. But in 1851, when Annie was 10 years old, she fell ill. Emma and Charles took her to the spa town of Malvern, hoping the water treatments there would cure her. For days they watched helplessly as she grew weaker. On April 23, 1851, Annie died, probably from tuberculosis. Charles was devastated. He had lost children before. Infant mortality was common in Victorian England, and 2 of their babies had died in infancy. But Annie's death struck differently. She was old enough to have a personality, to be a companion, to represent all the hopes and dreams parents have for their children. Charles wrote a memorial to her, describing her kindness, her dancing eyes, her joyousness. He never fully recovered from her death. Some historians believe that losing Annie deepened his doubts about a beneficent God. What kind of creator would design a world where innocent children suffered and died? Emma bore the loss with her characteristic faith, believing she would see Annie again in heaven. Charles could offer her no such comfort. He did not believe in an afterlife. For him, Annie was simply gone, the consciousness that had been her extinguished like a candle flame. This difference in how they processed grief was perhaps the most painful manifestation of their divergent beliefs. But life continued at Down House. They had more children, 10 in total, though 3 died young. The surviving children, William, Henrietta, George, Elizabeth, Francis, Leonard, and Horace, grew up in a household that was unusual for its time. Charles was an attentive father, playing with his children, telling them stories, taking them on walks. He converted the drawing room into a play area for them, tolerating noise and chaos that would have been unthinkable in most Victorian upper-class homes. He let them interrupt his work to show him beetles they had found, or questions they had about nature. The children were sometimes enlisted as research assistants. Charles would have them help with experiments, counting seeds or observing plant movements or collecting specimens. This was both practical, he genuinely needed help, and pedagogical, teaching them to observe carefully and think scientifically. His children learned natural history the way he had, through direct observation rather than textbooks. Life at Down House fell into a pattern that rarely varied, shaped by 2 factors: Charles's work and his mysterious illness. The illness had begun shortly after the Beagle voyage returned, or perhaps even during the voyage itself. Charles suffered from a constellation of symptoms that would plague him for the rest of his life. He experienced intense nausea and vomiting, often triggered by excitement or stress. He had headaches, fatigue, and what he called nervous symptoms: shaking, anxiety, a sense of impending doom. He developed an irregular heartbeat and chest pains. He had stomach cramps and boils that appeared on his skin. He suffered from eczema and other skin problems. He experienced what we might now call panic attacks, moments of acute terror that left him gasping and trembling. The symptoms were real, debilitating and puzzling. Victorian doctors had no idea what was wrong with him. They suggested various diagnoses: dyspepsia, nervous exhaustion, suppressed gout, hypochondria. They prescribed water treatments, which involved being wrapped in cold, wet sheets, and electrical stimulation, where weak electrical currents were applied to his body. They recommended various tonics and medicines, some containing arsenic, some containing alcohol, some containing substances that were probably more harmful than helpful. Nothing helped for long. Charles spent fortunes seeking cures, travelling to spas, consulting specialist after specialist, all to no avail. Modern physicians and historians have speculated endlessly about Darwin's illness. Was it Chagas disease? A parasitic infection transmitted by insects that bite and defecate on their victims, which Charles might have contracted in South America when he wrote in his diary about being bitten by the great black bug of the Pampas. Was it psychosomatic, his body's response to the stress of harbouring such dangerous ideas and fearing the reaction when he published them? Was it a genetic condition, an autoimmune disorder, or simply a collection of unrelated ailments that happened to afflict the same person? We will never know for certain. The symptoms were too varied, and the medical records too incomplete to diagnose across the span of 150 years. What we know is that the illness shaped his life completely. He could work only a few hours each day, usually in the morning. Any excitement, a visit from friends, a scientific controversy, even a dinner party, would leave him vomiting and confined to bed for days afterward. He became increasingly reclusive, avoiding social engagements that would have been expected of a man of his standing. He turned down invitations to scientific societies, declining honours that required his physical presence. He conducted his research through correspondence rather than personal interaction, writing thousands of letters to naturalists around the world, asking questions, sharing observations, building a network of collaborators without leaving his home. But within these severe constraints, he was remarkably productive. He organised his days with rigorous discipline, extracting the maximum value from his limited working hours. He rose early, usually around 7 a.m, and took a short walk before breakfast, often around the grounds of Down House, observing the plants and animals, thinking about his work. After breakfast at 7:45, he considered the morning his best working time. From 8 until 9:30 he worked in his study, a modest room at the front of the house with a window overlooking the garden. The room was cluttered with books, specimens, notes, and the tools of his work. Microscopes, magnifying glasses, specimen jars, measuring instruments. At 9:30 he would stop work and come to the drawing room where Emma would read to him from novels. He enjoyed this quiet time together, lying on the sofa while she read aloud. They read through all of Jane Austen's novels, George Eliot's works, Dickens, Trollope, anything that would take his mind off his work and his illness. They avoided heavy literature or anything too disturbing. He wanted distraction, not intellectual challenge during these rest periods. At 10:30, he would return to his study for another hour and a half of work, his second productive period of the day. By noon, he was exhausted and considered himself done for the day with serious work. After lunch, he would read his mail, which arrived in enormous quantities as his fame grew. Letters came from professional naturalists, amateur collectors, cranks with theories, admirers, critics, people seeking his opinion on everything from pigeon breeding to biblical interpretation. Then came his favourite part of the day, the walk on the sand walk. He had created this path through a small wood on the property, a circuit of perhaps a quarter mile. He had gravel laid down so he could walk in any weather. At the start of the path he would make a small pile of stones, and he would kick one aside with his walking stick each time he completed a circuit, counting his laps. 3 circuits was a short walk. 5 was a good walk. On rare good days he might complete 7 or 8. He walked alone, thinking about whatever problem he was currently wrestling with, turning it over in his mind, approaching it from different angles. Many of his best insights came during these solitary walks. The rest of the afternoon was spent resting, reading light material, or doing small tasks that didn't require intense concentration. He might look through specimens, organise notes, write brief letters. Evenings were for family time. He played backgammon with Emma, who kept careful score over the years. Eventually they played thousands of games, and Emma won more often than Charles, a fact he good-naturedly acknowledged. He read to the children or listened to them read. Emma played the piano, and he would lie on the sofa listening to the music, finding it soothing. He went to bed early, usually by 10 yoy or 10:30, seeking the sleep that often eluded him. Within this constrained life, he pursued research with maniacal focus and astonishing breadth. His work at Down House covered an extraordinary range of topics, each investigated with the same patient, methodical approach. He studied barnacles for 8 years, from 1846 to 1854, a period that seemed to his friends like a waste of his talents. Why was Darwin dissecting barnacles when he should be working on his theory of evolution? But the barnacle work served multiple purposes. It established him as a serious systematic biologist, not just a theoretical speculator. It taught him about variation within species, about adaptation to different environments, about the intricate details of anatomy and reproduction. He dissected thousands of specimens, examining them under his microscope, drawing detailed illustrations, corresponding with collectors around the world who sent him samples. He discovered that some species of barnacles were hermaphrodites, containing both male and female organs. He found tiny male barnacles living as parasites on the females of certain species, reduced to little more than reproductive organs. The work was tedious, but revealed the astonishing diversity of form and function, even within what appeared to be a simple group of creatures. The 4 volumes he published on barnacles, 2 on living species and 2 on fossils, were recognised as the definitive work on the subject. They won him the Royal Medal from the Royal Society in 1853, establishing his scientific credentials beyond question. When critics later attacked his evolution theory, they could not dismiss him as an amateur or dilettante. He had proven himself a careful, rigorous systematist who understood the details of anatomy and classification. But barnacles were only the beginning. Darwin conducted experiments in his garden and greenhouse that would eventually fill multiple books and papers. He bred pigeons, building a dovecote and keeping dozens of birds of different varieties. He joined pigeon fancier clubs in London, attending their meetings, talking with breeders who could create fantails with extravagant tail feathers or pouters with inflated crops or tumblers that performed backward somersaults in flight. These men, often working class, had achieved through selective breeding what seemed like miraculous transformations. They could take the common rock pigeon and, through careful selection across just a few generations, create forms so different they looked like separate species. This became one of Darwin's most powerful arguments. If humans could create such diversity through artificial selection in a few generations, what could nature accomplish through natural selection acting across millions of years? The pigeon breeders demonstrated evolution in miniature, showing that variation and selection could reshape living things. Darwin used domestic animals and plants throughout the origin of species as evidence that species were not fixed, that they could be modified, that the process of selection was real and powerful. He studied orchids, those exquisitely complex flowers that seemed designed to ensure cross-pollination. He grew dozens of species in his greenhouse, observing how each had evolved specialized structures to attract specific pollinators. Some orchids had nectaries shaped so that only insects with long tongues could reach the nectar. In the process of feeding, the insect would have pollen sacs attached to its head or back, which would then be transferred to the next flower it visited. Darwin found orchids that mimicked the appearance and even the scent of female insects, tricking male insects into attempting to mate with the flower and thus transferring pollen. He found orchids with explosive mechanisms that shot pollen onto visiting insects. Every species had its own elaborate tricks and mechanisms. In 1862, he examined a Madagascar orchid that had a nectary tube over 11 inches long. Darwin predicted that somewhere in Madagascar there must exist a moth with a tongue long enough to reach the nectar at the bottom of that tube. Critics mocked this prediction. But 40 years after Darwin's death, just such a moth was discovered, with a tongue that could extend over a foot in length. The orchid and the moth had co-evolved, each shaping the other across countless generations. Darwin had predicted this from pure reason, from understanding how natural selection worked. He studied climbing plants, observing how tendrils move in circular patterns, searching for supports to grasp. He measured the speed of these movements, noting that some plants complete a full circle every few hours. He experimented with putting objects of different shapes and textures near the tendrils, discovering which they preferred to grasp. He studied sundews and other carnivorous plants, watching how they caught and digested insects. He placed tiny pieces of meat on the sticky hairs of sundew leaves and observed how the leaves slowly curled around the prey, how the plant secreted digestive enzymes, how it absorbed nutrients. He studied the movements of plant roots and shoots, discovering that they responded to gravity, to light, to touch. He placed seedlings in different positions and measured how quickly and accurately they oriented themselves. He covered some with boxes and observed how they sought light. He touched roots and watched them bend away from the stimulus. All of this was evidence that plants, though they lacked nervous systems, could sense and respond to their environment, that they were more complex and sophisticated than most people realized. He studied earthworms, those humble creatures that most people dismissed as mere dirt dwellers. For decades, he observed how worms transform the soil, bringing buried objects slowly to the surface, mixing nutrients, improving drainage. He calculated that in every acre of land, earthworms might bring 10 tons of soil to the surface each year. Over centuries, their patient labour shaped the landscape, buried ancient Roman villas, levelled ground, created the rich topsoil that made agriculture possible. His final book, published in 1881 when he was 72 years old, was about earthworms, and it became a bestseller. Critics who expected great scientists to work only on grand subjects were puzzled, but Darwin saw profound principles in mundane subjects. Small causes, acting over long periods, could have enormous effects. This was the essence of his understanding of nature, and through it all, through the years of barnacles and pigeons and orchids, he continued working on the great theory, refining it, testing it, gathering evidence. He shared the secret with a few trusted friends, the botanist Joseph Hooker, the geologist Charles Lyell, a very small circle of men who understood what he was doing and why he had not yet published. Emma knew too, or at least suspected. She worried about what it would mean for his soul, for his reputation, for their family. But she supported him, creating a home where he could work, protecting him from social demands, raising their children, 10 in all, and managing the household. Emma Darwin was her husband's anchor, the person who kept him functioning when illness threatened to overwhelm him. By the 1850s, Charles had been working on his theory for nearly 20 years. He had notebooks full of evidence. He had correspondence with experts around the world. He had conducted experiments and observations that supported his ideas, but he still had not published. He kept thinking he needed more evidence, more time, more certainty. Part of this was perfectionism. Part was fear. Then, in June 1858, something arrived in the mail that shattered his careful planning and forced him to act. A letter from a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, working in the Malay archipelago, containing an essay that independently outlined the theory of natural selection. Wallace wanted Charles's opinion and help in getting it published. Charles was devastated. 20 years of work and someone else had thought of it first. Or rather, someone else had reached the same conclusion and was ready to publish before Charles had finished his evidence gathering. He wrote to Lyell in despair, "All my originality will be smashed." But Lyell and Hooker arranged a solution. On July 1st, 1858, at a meeting of the Linnean Society of London, they presented a joint paper. Wallace's essay and extracts from Charles's unpublished manuscripts from 1844 were read to the small audience. The presentation established that both men had independently developed the theory, and that Charles had priority by years of prior work, though Wallace deserved equal credit for the insight. The joint paper created almost no stir. The audience listened politely. A few people asked questions. But there was no sense that they had just heard a revolution announced. The president of the Linnean Society later wrote that 1858 had not been marked by any revolutionary discoveries. Charles, however, knew this was only the beginning. He now had to write the full book, the comprehensive work with all the evidence, all the arguments, all the careful reasoning that would convince the world, or at least the scientific world. He set aside all his other projects and began writing intensively. 13 months later, in November 1859, he published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. The book would sell out its first printing of 1,250 copies on the first day, and it would change everything. On November 24th, 1859, On the Origin of Species went on sale at John Murray's bookshop in London. Charles was not there. He had retreated to a spa in Yorkshire, seeking water treatment for his chronic illness and, more importantly, escaping the reaction he knew was coming. He had sent advance copies to key scientists, to friends, to potential critics. Now he waited anxiously for the response, vomiting from nervous tension. The book was carefully constructed to persuade. Charles did not begin with humans or with theology. He began with pigeons. Everyone in Victorian England knew about pigeon breeding. Fanciers could create birds with elaborate tail feathers or bizarre colorations through selective breeding. If humans could do this in a few generations, Charles argued, imagine what nature could accomplish in millions of years through the selection of naturally occurring variations. He presented evidence from geology, from paleontology, from embryology, from geographic distribution. He showed that the patterns of life made no sense if species were independently created, but made perfect sense if all life was related by descent with modification. He addressed every objection he could think of, particularly the problem of complex organs like the eye. How could natural selection produce something as intricate as an eye through gradual steps? Charles's answer was patient and thorough. Each small improvement in light sensitivity would provide an advantage. The ancestor of modern eyes might have been just a light-sensitive spot. Add a depression for directional sensitivity. Add a lens for focusing. Each step is an improvement over the previous one. Spread these small improvements across millions of years, and you can get from a simple light-sensitive patch to the magnificent camera eye of a vertebrate. Crucially, Charles barely mentioned human evolution in The Origin. He included only one cryptic sentence. Light will be thrown on the origin of a man and his history. He knew that the implications for humanity were clear to any reader, but he wanted the initial debate to focus on the evidence and the mechanism, not on the explosive question of whether humans had evolved from apes. The initial scientific response was mixed. Some scientists, particularly younger ones, embraced the theory enthusiastically. Thomas Huxley, a brilliant anatomist and debater, became Darwin's bulldog, defending evolution in public debates and publications. He later claimed that upon reading The Origin, he thought, "How stupid not to have thought of that myself." Joseph Hooker, Charles's close friend and one of Britain's leading botanists, supported the theory. So did Lyell eventually, though with reservations. Many geologists and paleontologists found the evidence compelling. Gradually, within a decade or so, most working scientists accepted that evolution had occurred, even if they debated the mechanism. But there was also fierce resistance. Richard Owen, the anatomist who had identified Charles's fossils from the Beagle voyage, became one of evolution's bitterest opponents. Louis Agassiz, the great Swiss-American naturalist, rejected the theory entirely. Sedgwick, Charles's old geology mentor from Cambridge, was appalled, writing to Charles that he had read the book with more pain than pleasure. The religious opposition was immediate and intense. The idea that humans were descended from apes was seen as degrading, as denying human dignity and divine purpose. If we were just evolved animals, what became of the soul? What became of morality? What was the basis for human rights or justice? The famous confrontation came at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science at Oxford in June 1860. The Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, gave a speech attacking Darwin's theory. He was a skilled orator, nicknamed Soapy Sam for his smoothness, and he ridiculed the notion that humans descended from apes. Turning to Thomas Huxley, who was in the audience, Wilberforce asked sarcastically whether Huxley claimed descent from an ape through his grandfather or his grandmother. Huxley rose to respond. He said that he would not be ashamed to have an ape for an ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his gifts to obscure the truth. It was a devastating rejoinder. The audience erupted. Some accounts claimed that a woman fainted. Robert Fitzroy, Charles's old captain from the Beagle, was present and waved a Bible, shouting that the word of God should be believed over human speculation. The battle lines were drawn. Charles stayed away from public controversy. His health could not tolerate the stress of debate, but he followed every review, every criticism, every letter. He revised the Origin through 6 editions, adding new evidence, addressing objections, clarifying arguments. With each edition, the case grew stronger. In 1871, 12 years after the Origin, Charles finally tackled the question he had avoided: the descent of man and selection in relation to sex was published, applying evolutionary theory directly to humans. The book argued that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors, that all the mental and moral faculties that seemed to set humans apart were present in rudimentary form in other animals, and that sexual selection, the competition for mates, had shaped many human traits. The descent was even more controversial than the Origin. It attacked the Victorian belief in the fundamental gap between humans and animals. It suggested that morality itself had evolved, that ethics was not handed down from God but had developed through natural selection as a social instinct that helped groups survive. Even many of Darwin's supporters found this difficult to accept, but the evidence kept accumulating. Fossil discoveries began filling in the evolutionary tree. Neanderthal remains were found, showing that other human species had existed. The similarities between human and ape anatomy became harder to dismiss. Embryology showed that human embryos pass through stages that resemble fish and reptiles. The overwhelming weight of evidence was on Darwin's side. By the 1870s, evolution was accepted by most scientists and many educated laypeople. Natural selection, as the mechanism, remained more controversial, but the basic fact of evolution was established. Darwin had succeeded. The theory he had been afraid to publish for 20 years was now the foundation of biology. But the cost had been high. The stress of controversy, the attacks on his character and his science, the knowledge that he had caused Emma pain by undermining her faith, all of this took a toll. His health, never good, deteriorated further. He continued working, but more slowly, on smaller projects. The books kept coming, about earthworms, about carnivorous plants, about the movements of climbing plants. But the revolutionary work was done. And as Charles entered his 60s and then his 70s, his body finally began to fail in ways that even his iron will could not overcome. The man who had changed the world through the power of observation and reason was about to face the one force that no theory could explain away or overcome. By the late 1870s, Charles Darwin was in his 70s and visibly failing. The mysterious illness that had plagued him since the Beagle voyage had worsened. The chest pains and irregular heartbeat that had troubled him for years were now frequent and severe. He was diagnosed with angina pectoris, a condition of the heart that Victorian medicine could do little to treat. He knew he did not have much time left, but he kept working. Even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp and his curiosity undiminished. He continued his experiments on plant movements, studying how roots respond to gravity and how leaves turn toward light. He wrote his final book, The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Worms, published in October 1881, just 6 months before his death. It was a study of how earthworms, through their patient labour over countless generations, transformed the soil and shaped the landscape. Critics found it an odd topic for a great scientist's final work, but it embodied everything that made Charles a great naturalist: the ability to see profound processes in humble creatures, the willingness to observe patiently over long periods, the recognition that small causes could have large effects. The book sold better than any of his works except The Origin. The first printing of 2,000 copies sold immediately, and more had to be printed. Even in his final year, Charles Darwin could still make people see the world differently. His daily routine had grown shorter. He could work only an hour or two in the morning before exhaustion forced him to rest. He still walked his beloved sand walk when the weather permitted, though now he needed help and could only manage a few circuits. His dog Polly, who had accompanied him for years, had died, and he missed her presence. Emma remained his constant companion, reading to him, sitting with him, providing the comfort and stability that had sustained him for 43 years of marriage. The chest pains grew worse through the winter of 1881 to 1882. Several times Charles thought he was dying. Each episode left him weaker. His physician, Dr. Andrew Clark, could offer only rest and opiates for the pain. There was no treatment for heart failure in 1882, no bypass surgeries or stents, or medications that could have extended his life. His heart was wearing out, and all anyone could do was wait. In March 1882, Charles collapsed while walking in the garden at Down House. He was helped inside and put to bed. Over the next few weeks he rallied slightly, then worsened again. He dozed frequently, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused. The family gathered. His children, his grown sons and daughters, took turns sitting with him. They knew the end was approaching. On April 18th, Charles suffered a severe angina attack. He told Emma that he felt as if he were dying. She comforted him, held his hand. His son Francis sat nearby. Charles told them he was not afraid of death. He expressed his gratitude for Emma's devotion, for her years of care and patience. He asked her to tell all the children how good they'd been to him. Emma, exhausted from weeks of vigil, rested briefly. While she slept, Charles told Henrietta and Francis how grateful he was for their care during his final illness. "It's almost worthwhile to be sick to be nursed by you," he said, a characteristic mixture of affection and wry humour. As night fell, Charles grew weaker. His breathing became laboured. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Shortly before 4 in the afternoon on April 19th, 1882, with Emma by his side, Charles Darwin took his last breath. He was 73 years old. He died as he had lived, quietly, without drama, surrounded by family, in the house where he had done his most important work. The family expected to bury him in the small churchyard of St. Mary's in Down Village, near the house where he had spent 40 years. It would have been a quiet funeral, a country burial for a man who had avoided public attention whenever possible. Charles would probably have preferred it that way. But the nation had other plans. As news of Darwin's death spread, petitions began pouring in from scientific societies, universities, and prominent citizens. Charles Darwin should not be buried in an obscure country churchyard. He should be honoured with a place in Westminster Abbey, the national shrine where Britain buried its kings and greatest men. He deserved to lie near Isaac Newton, near the other giants of British science. The Darwin family hesitated. They knew Charles's religious doubts. They worried about the propriety of burying a man who had questioned Christianity in the holiest site in England. But the petitions were overwhelming. The Dean of Westminster agreed. Parliament supported it. William Spottiswoode, President of the Royal Society made the formal arrangements. The funeral took place on April 26, 1882, a week after Charles's death. It was a state occasion. The pallbearers included some of the most distinguished men in Britain: Thomas Huxley, Joseph Hooker, Alfred Russel Wallace, the Duke of Argyll. The abbey was packed with members of Parliament, representatives of foreign governments, scientists, clergy, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Darwin's work. The service followed traditional Anglican rites, though with certain ironies that Charles might have appreciated. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered for the soul of a man who had questioned whether souls existed. The anthem was a passage from Proverbs: "Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding." Charles was buried in the floor of the abbey's north aisle, close to Isaac Newton. His grave is marked by a simple white stone with his name, dates, and no other inscription. Millions of tourists pass over it each year, many without knowing who he was or what he did. But the scientists who come know. They understand that beneath that stone lies a man who changed everything, who showed humanity its true place in nature, who gave us the key to understanding the diversity of life. The man who was too shy to speak in public, who hid from controversy, who spent his life in a country house studying barnacles and earthworms, had become one of the most influential figures in human history. The theory he had feared to publish had become the organizing principle of all biology. The idea that seemed so dangerous in Victorian England was now taught in schools around the world. But even in death, Darwin's influence was just beginning to be felt. Over the next century and a half, his ideas would continue to transform human understanding in ways even he could not have imagined. The immediate years after Darwin's death saw evolution become established scientific orthodoxy. By the 1880s, virtually every working biologist accepted that evolution had occurred, even if debates continued about the mechanisms. Museums around the world reorganized their exhibits to show evolutionary relationships between species. Textbooks were rewritten. University courses taught Darwinian evolution as fundamental biology. The discovery of genetics in the early 20th century, when Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance was rediscovered, initially seemed to challenge Darwin. Geneticists thought their findings contradicted natural selection. But by the 1930s and 1940s, the modern synthesis combined Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian genetics, creating a unified theory that explained both how traits were inherited and how populations evolved. Darwin had been right about natural selection, even though he had not understood the mechanism of inheritance. The discovery of DNA in 1953 provided even stronger confirmation. Genes were real, physical molecules that could be measured and studied. Mutations could be observed. The molecular evidence showed that all life shares the same genetic code, exactly as Darwin's theory of common descent predicted. The fossil record grew richer. Transitional forms were found: fish with legs, reptiles with feathers, apes with larger brains. Every new discovery fit into the evolutionary framework. By the 21st century, evolution had become the foundation not just of biology, but of medicine, agriculture, computer science, and countless other fields. Doctors understand disease by studying how viruses and bacteria evolve resistance to drugs. Farmers breed new crops by understanding selection pressures. Computer scientists solve problems using evolutionary algorithms. The theory Darwin developed while studying finches on remote islands had become essential to modern technological civilization. Yet the controversy never entirely died. In the United States and parts of the Muslim world, evolution remains contested by religious fundamentalists who interpret their scriptures literally. School boards debate whether evolution should be taught. Museums face protests. The battle that began in 1860 at Oxford continues in different forms, though scientists have long since moved on. Charles Darwin did not set out to undermine religion or to promote atheism. He saw himself as a naturalist following evidence wherever it led. But he did undermine the Victorian confidence that humans were specially created and fundamentally different from animals. He forced people to see themselves as part of nature, as products of the same natural processes that shaped finches and orchids and earthworms. This was liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant humans could understand themselves scientifically, could study human behaviour and psychology and evolution as natural phenomena. Terrifying because it removed the comforting sense of divine purpose and special status. If we are just evolved apes, what is the meaning of life? What is the basis for ethics? These questions troubled Darwin himself. He struggled with them in his private notebooks and in letters to friends. He concluded that morality itself had evolved, that the social instincts that make us care for family and tribe had been selected for because they helped groups survive. This was not the answer Victorian Christianity wanted to hear, but it was an answer grounded in observation and evidence. Today, Charles Darwin's ideas permeate how we think about the world. Every biology textbook begins with evolution. Every zoo exhibit explains how species are related. Every nature documentary discusses adaptation and selection. The tree of life that Darwin sketched in his notebooks in the 1830s is now known in extraordinary detail, with millions of branches representing every species that has ever been discovered, and thousands more being added each year. We now know that humans are apes, members of the great ape family along with chimpanzees, gorillas and orangutans. We share 98.8% of our DNA with chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. Our ancestors split from their ancestors about 6 million years ago, and the fossil record now documents many intermediate forms between that common ancestor and modern humans. Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis. The evolutionary path that led to us is increasingly well understood. More remarkably, Darwin's basic insights have extended beyond biology. Evolutionary thinking influences economics, psychology, philosophy, linguistics, even art and literature. The idea that complex systems can emerge from simple processes, that order can arise without a designer, that change happens through variation and selection. These Darwinian insights apply far beyond the biological world he studied. Charles Darwin lies buried in Westminster Abbey, but his true monument is not stone. It is the transformed understanding of life itself, the recognition that all living things are related, that we are part of nature, not separate from it, that the diversity and complexity of life arose through natural processes acting over vast stretches of time. Every genetic sequence mapped, every fossil discovered, every field study of animal behaviour, every insight into human psychology builds on the foundation he established. The shy naturalist who spent his life avoiding confrontation and public attention became the centre of the greatest intellectual revolution since Copernicus. The invalid who could work only a few hours a day produced more significant science than most healthy scholars accomplish in full careers. The man who doubted his own abilities changed how humanity understands its place in the cosmos. If Charles Darwin could see the world today, he would be astonished by the technologies that confirm his insights. DNA sequencing, satellite tracking of animal migrations, experimental evolution in laboratories, all of these would seem like magic. But he would recognize the fundamental questions being asked. How do species adapt? How does variation arise? How does selection shape populations? These are still the questions that drive evolutionary biology, the questions he first asked while examining finches on volcanic islands and fossils in Argentine cliffs. We end where we began. at Down House in Kent, where Charles Darwin lived and worked for 40 years. The house is now a museum. You can walk through his study, see his microscope and notebooks, follow the sand walk where he took his daily walks. The gardens where he grew his orchids and studied his climbing plants are maintained much as they were in his lifetime. Visitors come from around the world to this quiet house in an English village, pilgrims to a shrine of scientific thought. They stand in the study where On the Origin of Species was written, and they try to imagine the courage it took to write it. They walk the path where Darwin walked, kicking stones to count his circuits, and they think about the patient observation that led to revolutionary insights. They see the simple tools he used, magnifying glasses and pins and specimen jars, and they understand that greatness does not require elaborate equipment. Only a questioning mind and the willingness to look carefully at what others overlook. Charles Darwin showed us that truth emerges from observation, from careful accumulation of evidence, from following patterns wherever they lead, even when they lead to uncomfortable conclusions. He showed us that simple mechanisms, given enough time, can produce extraordinary complexity. He showed us that we're not separate from nature but part of it, shaped by the same forces that shaped every other living thing. The child who collected beetles in Shropshire, the young man who got seasick on the Beagle, the patient observer of earthworms and orchids changed forever how humanity understands itself. Every time a doctor prescribes an antibiotic with an understanding that bacteria evolve, every time a conservationist protects an endangered species by understanding its ecological relationships, every time a student learns that all life is related, the legacy of Charles Darwin lives on. He was a man who doubted himself constantly yet persevered, a man who suffered chronic illness yet accomplished extraordinary work, a man who loved his family deeply while developing ideas that troubled them, a man who avoided confrontation yet started the greatest intellectual revolution of modern times, a man who studied the smallest creatures with the greatest patience and saw in them the keys to understanding all of life. If you have found value in this journey through Charles Darwin's remarkable life, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to know in the comments which part of Darwin's story resonates most with you. Perhaps it was his transformation from failed medical student to great scientist. Perhaps it was his courage in publishing dangerous ideas. Perhaps it was simply his patient observation and willingness to see what was truly there, not what he expected to see. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. The man who discovered the law of evolution rests in Westminster Abbey, but his true monument is the living world itself, the endless forms most beautiful that surround us, all related, all descended from common ancestors, all shaped by the patient work of variation and selection across deep time. Good night.